The old house at the end of Fairview Road had always been an enigma. It stood rotting, abandoned for decades, as if frozen in time. Over the years, the locals had woven countless chilling tales around its decaying structure, warning children to steer clear. Some said it was haunted, cursed even. Others whispered that the house had claimed lives, though no one seemed to remember who or when. But to Taylor and her friends, the eerie stories were just part of its appeal. It was Halloween, and as teenagers often do, they craved a thrill. Taylor had heard the rumors all her life, people hearing whispers when no one was there, feeling cold spots in the house, and seeing figures move in the windows long after nightfall. None of it frightened her enough to back out. In fact, she'd suggested that they spend the night there as a dare. No one could say no, of course. Not on Halloween. It was dusk when the group of five, Taylor, Emma, Josh, Chloe, and Marcus, stood outside the house. The air was crisp, and the distant sound of trick-or-treaters barely reached them. As they approached the creaking front door, an unsettling sensation washed over them all, though none would admit it. They pushed their way inside. The house smelled of rot, damp wood, and something metallic. The floorboards groaned beneath their weight, and the walls were peeling in long strips, revealing years of neglect. "Let's find a room to set up camp," Marcus said, trying to shake off the unsettling atmosphere. Taylor led the way, holding her phone's flashlight ahead of her. The beam cut through the darkness, but it did little to soothe their growing unease. Shadows seemed to stretch and move as they passed through the dimly lit halls. After wandering for a while, they settled in the large living room, whose massive windows were smeared with grime. A long abandoned fireplace sat at the far end, its hearth filled with soot. They laid out their blankets and snacks, the comfort of each other's company easing their nerves. For a while, the group laughed, joked, and tried to scare one another with their own spooky stories. But as the night crept on, strange things began to happen. It started with the sounds. Faint at first, barely audible footsteps on the floor above them, a shuffling in the distance. Josh dismissed it as raccoons or some other critter, but Emma wasn't so sure. The laughter faded and silence set in, thick as the musty air around them. Chloe turned on a small portable speaker to drown out the uneasy quiet, but the second she did, there was a loud thud from upstairs, loud enough to make everyone jump. It was the unmistakable sound of something heavy falling. "Did you hear that?" Taylor whispered, her voice shaky. She grabbed Josh's arm, eyes wide. "It's probably just part of the ceiling caving in. This place is ancient," he replied, though his tone lacked conviction. Then came the knocking. 3 loud bangs echoed through the house, each one seeming to reverberate closer and closer. Josh stood up, grabbing a flashlight. "I'm checking it out," he said, but Marcus grabbed his arm. "Are you insane? We'll stick together." They agreed, moving as a group, stepping cautiously down the hallway. Every creak beneath their feet felt magnified in the oppressive silence. As they ascended the stairs, the air seemed to grow colder, heavier, until their breath was visible in the frigid dark. The top of the stairs led into a long corridor, the wallpaper curling in patches, revealing the bare wooden walls beneath. They walked, their nerves on edge. It wasn't until they reached the end of the hall that they noticed the door, slightly ajar. It hadn't been open earlier. They were certain of it. Josh pushed it open wider, revealing a small bedroom, mostly barren, save for an old rocking chair that sat eerily in the center of the room. "I don't like this," Chloe whispered. Then the chair moved. Slowly. It rocked back and forth, creaking with each sway, though there was no breeze, no one near it. Taylor's breath caught in her throat as they all stood frozen in terror. Suddenly, Emma let out a sharp scream. She was staring at the window, her face pale, trembling. "There's someone out there," she gasped. The group rushed to the window, but outside was only darkness. The house was surrounded by dense trees, their branches barely illuminated by the moonlight. But as they squinted, trying to see what Emma had, something moved. Just beyond the tree line, a tall figure stood, barely visible, cloaked in shadow. Its outline was grotesque, distorted, almost unnatural. And it wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the darkness, each one worse than the last, bent, broken, their limbs hanging at unnatural angles. They didn't move like people. They swayed, like marionettes on strings. "Run!" Marcus yelled, pulling Emma back from the window. They bolted down the stairs, the air thick with panic. As they reached the ground floor, the front door slammed shut on its own with a deafening crash. The sound reverberated through the house as though the walls themselves were alive, mocking their fear. Taylor scrambled to pull the door open, but it wouldn't budge. "Help me!" she screamed. Marcus and Josh threw their weight against it, but it remained shut, as if held by some unseen force. The knocking started again, this time louder, angrier. It was coming from all sides now, as though the house was surrounded. Windows rattled, footsteps echoed from every direction, and the very air seemed to hum with malevolence. And then, from the hallway, a voice. Faint, soft, but undeniably human. "Come play with us?" They turned as one, eyes wide in horror. Standing in into the hall was a small child, her hair matted and face pale. But there was something wrong. Her eyes, empty, black voids, stared through them, soulless. Behind her, more figures appeared, their bodies twisted, crawling out from the walls, the floor, and even the ceiling. Taylor's heart pounded in her chest, her vision blurring with terror. She pulled the others toward the back of the house, desperate for any escape. But as they ran, the house seemed to stretch and change, the rooms twisting and morphing around them. No matter which direction they turned, they found themselves back in that same room, facing the rocking chair. The air grew thick with whispers, a chorus of voices calling their names, taunting them. "Stay with us. Forever." The walls closed in, shadows crawling toward them like living entities. Taylor felt a cold hand brush her neck, a sensation that sent ice down her spine. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Or was there? The last thing Taylor remembered was the scream, an inhuman guttural wail that echoed through the house, reverberating in her bones. It wasn't her scream, nor any of her friends. It was something else, something ancient, something hungry. And then silence. The next morning, the house at the end of Fairview Road stood as it always had, silent, decaying, untouched. There was no sign of Taylor or her friends, no indication that anyone had been there at all. But if you listen closely, especially on cold Halloween nights, some say you can still hear the faint sound of laughter and screams coming from the house. And if you're unlucky enough to pass by, you might catch a glimpse of figures standing at the window, watching, waiting for the next group to come and play. Late October brought with it a biting chill and an unrelenting fog that wrapped around the small town like a suffocating blanket. In the heart of this forgotten place stood an old hospital, long abandoned and left to decay. Most people in town avoided it, haunted by stories of the horrors that had once taken place inside its walls. The building had been closed for years after a string of gruesome incidents, patients disappearing, nurses going mad, doctors found dead in inexplicable circumstances. To the locals, the hospital was cursed, a place where the veil between life and death was thin, where the lost souls of those who perished there still lingered. But none of that mattered to Jake, Claire, Eric, and Dana. They were thrill seekers, drawn to the adrenaline rush that came with exploring the unknown. So, when they heard about the old hospital, they couldn't resist. Halloween was approaching, and they wanted to do something that would outdo every other scare they had ever experienced. They arrived just after midnight, armed with flashlights and phones to document their adventure. The fog was thicker than they had expected, swirling around the hospital like a living thing. The building loomed before them, its once white walls stained with years of grime and neglect. Windows were shattered, doors hung off their hinges, and the sign at the entrance, St. Bartholomew's Hospital, was barely legible beneath the layers of dirt. "Creepy as hell," Jake muttered, but he grinned, the excitement clear in his voice. Claire shivered, more from the atmosphere than the cold. "Are we really doing this? Come on, we've done worse," Eric said, leading the way up the cracked stone steps. The heavy front doors groaned as they pushed them open, revealing the dark, cavernous lobby. The air inside was cold, much colder than it had been outside, and it smelled of mold, decay, and something else, something metallic. The sound of their footsteps echoed unnaturally in the vast space, making it feel like the building was swallowing them whole. "Let's split up and see what we can find," Dana suggested, her voice low, almost drowned out by the oppressive silence. "Bad idea in every horror movie ever," Jake joked, but they agreed anyway, splitting into pairs. Jake with Claire, Eric with Dana. Jake and Claire moved toward what had once been the patient wards. The hallways were narrow and lined with rusted gurneys, shattered glass, and peeling paint. As they moved deeper into the hospital, the sense of unease grew. Claire felt like they were being watched, but every time she turned around, there was nothing there. just empty hallways, stretching endlessly behind them. I don't like this, Claire whispered, her grip tightening on Jake's arm. It's just your imagination. Jake replied, though even his voice lacked its usual bravado. Suddenly, they heard it, a faint, shuffling noise from the end of the hall. Jake swung his flashlight in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing there, just more debris and darkness. Did you hear that? Claire asked, her voice trembling. Yeah, Jake said, his voice now tense. Probably a raccoon or something, but deep down they both knew it wasn't. Meanwhile, Eric and Dana were exploring the lower levels, the morgue and storage areas. The air grew colder as they descended the stairs, and the atmosphere was oppressive, like the weight of the entire building was pressing down on them. The walls down here were damp, and the smell of rot was stronger. As they entered the morgue, Dana felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The room was lined with old, rusted metal drawers, the kind used to store bodies. Most were sealed shut, but a few had been left open, their contents long removed. The room felt wrong, like something terrible had happened there, something unspeakable. Why would anyone work here? Dana muttered, rubbing her arms as if trying to ward off the cold. Eric shone his flashlight around the room, illuminating old equipment, scalpels, saws, and blood-stained instruments that had been left to rust. I don't know, but let's get some pictures and get out of here. This place is giving me the creeps. As Dana lifted her phone to take a picture, the flashlight flickered. And then they heard it, a soft, wheezing breath like someone gasping for air. It was faint, but unmistakable. Did you hear that? Eric whispered, his voice barely audible. Dana nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The breath came again, louder this time, echoing through the room. Slowly, they turned toward the sound. One of the body drawers, which had been tightly sealed just moments ago, was now slightly ajar. No way, Dana breathed. Eric stepped forward, reaching out to push the drawer closed, but before his hand could touch it, the drawer slid open on its own, revealing the inside. It was empty, except for a single handprint, smeared in blood, across the bottom of the drawer. They bolted from the room, their footsteps loud in the oppressive silence of the hospital. But as they ran, the lights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. And then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps followed them, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Jake and Claire weren't faring much better. As they moved through the old patient ward, they started to hear things. Whispers, faint voices, too soft to make out, but undeniably there. The rooms they passed were filled with decaying hospital beds, some of them still equipped with rusted restraints. The walls were scrawled with strange symbols, drawn in what looked like dried blood. Suddenly, Claire froze. Jake, look. At the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. It stood motionless, just staring at them. Its body was thin, almost skeletal, and it was dressed in what looked like a patient's gown, stained and torn. But what terrified Claire most was its face. It had no features. Just smooth, pale skin where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Oh my God, Claire whispered, backing away. Jake grabbed her arm, pulling her down the hallway. But as they ran, the sound of shuffling footsteps echoed behind them. Faster now, gaining on them. They burst through a set of double doors, slamming them shut behind them. But as they caught their breath, they realized they weren't alone. The room they had entered was filled with hospital beds, and in each bed lay a figure, covered by a thin sheet. One of the sheets moved. Claire screamed as the figure beneath the sheet sat up, the outline of its body visible in the dim light. Slowly the sheet slid off, revealing a face that was impossibly familiar. It was Jake. But how could that be? He was standing right next to her. Jake stared in disbelief at the doppelganger in the bed, its eyes wide, mouth twisted in a silent scream. And then it moved, lunging at them with inhuman speed. In the chaos, they ran. The hospital seemed to come alive around them, the walls closing in, the whispers growing louder. The building was no longer just a structure, it was a living, breathing entity, and it didn't want them to leave. By the time they found Eric and Dana, all four of them were frantic, desperate to escape. But the hospital had other plans. The doors they had come through were gone, the hallways twisting and changing with every turn. And the whispers, those awful disembodied voices, grew louder, taunting them, calling their names. One by one, the group began to fall apart. Dana disappeared first, taken by something they couldn't see, her screams echoing through the hospital before they were abruptly cut off. Then Eric vanished into the shadows, his flashlight flickering out as he was swallowed by the darkness. It was just Jake and Claire now, running blindly through the maze of hallways, desperately searching for a way out. But no matter which direction they turned, they found themselves back in the same place, the morgue. The last thing Claire saw before the darkness consumed her was the handprint on the body drawer, smeared in fresh blood. The next morning, the town was quiet, as it always was. No one noticed that 4 people had gone missing. No one would remember them. The hospital, now just a crumbling relic of the past, stood silent in the fog. But if you listen closely, you might hear the faint sound of footsteps or the soft whispers of voices long lost, calling for those brave or foolish enough to enter. And once you enter, you never leave. The old forest on the edge of town was a place people rarely ventured. Dense and dark, it was known as Black Hollow, a name that evoked fear in everyone who heard it. Legends swirled around the place, tales of people entering the woods and never returning, of strange lights flickering through the trees, and of an ancient evil that resided deep within its heart. But like all legends, they were easily dismissed until someone you knew disappeared. Ben, Sarah, Mike, and Jess were locals who had grown up hearing the stories, and like many others, they never really believed them. But when a classmate, Lucas, vanished, after claiming he'd spent the night camping in Black Hollow, they couldn't help but be intrigued. Lucas had been missing for a week, and the search parties had turned up nothing. His tent and belongings were found undisturbed on the edge of the forest, but he was gone without a trace. The police declared it a tragic accident, another victim swallowed by the wilderness. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She had known Lucas for years, and something about his disappearance gnawed at her. She remembered how he'd joked about going deep into Black Hollow, daring himself to reach the clearing at the center, where the witch tree stood, a twisted, ancient oak said to be cursed. When Sarah told the others about Lucas's plan, they decided to do what everyone else was too afraid to. They'd find the clearing, find the tree, and maybe, just maybe, find Lucas. It was late afternoon when they set out, the sky overcast, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The entrance to Black Hollow was unmarked, just a thin path that quickly vanished into the shadows of the towering trees. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to close in around them, the underbrush thickening, the air growing colder, unnaturally so. "I don't like this," Jess muttered, clutching her jacket tighter as a chill wind blew through the trees. "Just keep moving," Mike said, his voice steady though his eyes darted nervously at every sound. It wasn't long before they began to feel it, the sense of being watched. The further they walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees, gnarled and blackened, seemed to twist and lean toward them, their branches like skeletal hands reaching for their throats. The silence was deafening. No birds, no insects, nothing but the sound of their own footsteps crunching through the leaves. After what felt like hours, the path opened into a clearing, and there it was, the witch tree. The tree was unlike any they had ever seen. It was massive, its trunk twisted and black as if scorched by fire, but it was alive. Its branches stretched high into the sky, but they were bare, devoid of leaves, covered instead with strange markings, symbols that looked ancient and carved deep into the wood. The ground around the tree was bare, the soil dark and lifeless, as if nothing could grow near it. Ben approached first, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the tree's surface. "This is it," he said quietly, though there was no need to say it. They all knew. The witch tree. As they circled the tree, Sarah noticed something strange at its base. An indentation, like a shallow grave. Kneeling down, she brushed the dirt away, and her hand hit something cold. A shiver ran down her spine as she pulled out a small, tarnished pendant. It was Lucas's. "Guys, look at this," she said, her voice trembling. Lucas was here. The others gathered around, their faces pale. They had all seen the pendant before. Lucas wore it every day. There was no doubt now that he had reached the witch tree. Suddenly, a noise cut through the silence. A soft, low whisper, barely audible, like the wind passing through the trees. But it wasn't the wind, it was a voice. They all froze, listening. "Leave." The whisper seemed to come from all directions at once, swirling around them like a cold breeze. Ben took a step back, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath them trembled, and the tree seemed to groan, the wood creaking as if it were alive. The symbols on its bark began to glow, faintly at first, but growing brighter with every passing second. And then, from the base of the tree, something began to emerge. A figure, thin, gaunt, its skin stretched tight over bone, crawled out of the dirt. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to see everything. It dragged itself toward them, its limbs twisted and broken, moving in ways no human body should. As it pulled itself free of the earth, more figures appeared, dozens of them, clawing their way out from beneath the tree, their skeletal fingers reaching out, mouths open in silent screams. Jess screamed, backing away, but her foot caught on a root and she fell hard. Ben grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "We need to go," he yelled, his voice cracking with fear. The figures were moving faster now, their broken bodies swaying as they advanced. Their faces were all wrong, distorted, twisted by death, their mouths stretched into ghastly, unnatural grins. And then Sarah saw it. Among the dead, crawling out from the base of the tree, Lucas. His face was pale, eyes wide with terror, but his body was no longer his own. He moved with the same jerky, unnatural motion as the others, his limbs bent and twisted in impossible ways. His mouth opened, and though no sound came out, Sarah could hear his voice in her mind, pleading, begging, "Help me." But there was no time. They turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, their hearts pounding in their chests. The whispers followed them, growing louder, angrier, until the very trees seemed to be screaming at them. Branches lashed out, tearing at their clothes, their skin, as if the forest itself was trying to drag them back. They didn't stop running until they burst through the edge of the forest, the dark trees looming behind them like silent sentinels. Gasping for breath, they collapsed onto the ground, their bodies shaking, their minds reeling from what they had just seen. But they weren't safe. The whispers had followed them. Even now, standing at the edge of town, they could hear it, soft, insistent, calling them back. And deep in the heart of Black Hollow, the witch tree waited, its roots spreading further, reaching for the living, pulling them into its grasp. No one ever spoke of what happened that night, but over the following weeks, more people disappeared, those who dared to go near the forest, or who claimed they had heard strange whispers in their sleep. The town was slowly devoured by fear, and in time, Black Hollow was abandoned, left to the shadows and the dead. But sometimes, late at night, if you stand at the edge of the forest and listen closely, you can still hear them. The whispers of those who are trapped, lost forever beneath the witch tree. And if you're foolish enough to enter, you might join them. It was a cold autumn night when the power went out in the small rural town of Mill Haven. A heavy storm had rolled in, and the winds howled like a banshee, rattling windows and shaking doors. The streets were deserted, and most people were huddled inside, waiting for the storm to pass. But in the dark, in the oldest part of town, there stood a house. It had been abandoned for decades, an old Victorian mansion that loomed at the end of a crooked lane. The locals called it the Widow's House, a name whispered in hushed tones. Everyone knew the story, or at least a version of it. The house had belonged to Margaret Holloway, a wealthy widow who had lived there alone for many years. Her husband had died under mysterious circumstances, and after his death, Margaret became a recluse. Neighbors said they could hear strange noises coming from the house at night, chanting, crying, sometimes even laughter. Then, one day, she disappeared. No one ever saw her again, but the house remained, frozen in time, untouched by progress or change. Over the years, the house became a source of fascination for the local teenagers. It was said that Margaret had been a witch, that she had cursed the house, and that anyone who entered would never come out the same. Some claimed they had seen lights in the windows, though no one had lived there for over a century. Others swore they heard her voice, calling from within. But most people just stayed away. No one wanted to test the stories. No one, that is, except for Jason, Emily, Mark, and Leah. They were bored, restless, and looking for a thrill. The storm had knocked out the power across town, and there was nothing to do. Jason, the de facto leader of the group, suggested they go to the widow's house. It was the perfect night, he said. The darkness, the storm, the legends. Emily and Leah were hesitant, but Mark, always up for a challenge, agreed immediately. With no better plans, they grabbed their flashlights, put on their raincoats, and set off. The walk to the widow's house was eerie. The wind whipped through the trees and the rain pounded against their jackets. The streets were dark, save for the occasional flash of lightning that lit up the sky in brilliant bursts. The closer they got to the house, the more oppressive the air seemed to become. It was as if the storm was alive, pushing them toward the house, guiding them. When they reached the end of the crooked lane, the house came into view, standing tall and imposing, its windows like black, unblinking eyes staring down at them. The front gate was rusted, hanging open slightly, as if it had been waiting for them. "This is it," Jason said, grinning despite the nervous energy that hung between them. Emily shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. "Are we really doing this?" "We came all this way," Mark said. "Might as well see what all the fuss is about." Leah, usually the cautious one, hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Let's just take a quick look and get out of here." They pushed open the gate, which groaned loudly in protest, and walked up the overgrown path to the front door. The porch creaked under their weight, and Jason reached out, gripping the old brass doorknob. "It's locked," he said, jiggling the knob. "Of course, it's locked," Emily replied, rolling her eyes. "No one's lived here for 100 years." But just as she spoke, a loud click echoed in the silence, and the door swung open slowly, as if it had been waiting for them. For a moment, none of them moved. The open door revealed only darkness inside, but there was something about it, something wrong. The air seemed heavier, colder, and the sound of the storm outside felt muted, distant. "Okay, that's creepy," Leah muttered. Jason stepped inside first, his flashlight cutting through the dark. "It's just an old house," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. One by one, they followed him in. The inside of the house was exactly what you'd expect from a place abandoned for so long, dusty, cold, and filled with the smell of mildew and decay. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like ghostly curtains. But it was more than just the neglect. There was a sense of presence in the house, something that felt alive and aware of them. Mark shined his flashlight across the hallway. "This place gives me the creeps." "Let's just look around for a minute and leave," Emily suggested, her voice tight with unease. They wandered through the downstairs rooms, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty spaces. The house seemed to groan and sigh as they moved, the wood settling beneath their feet. But soon, they began to hear something else. A faint sound like footsteps, but not their own. Slow, deliberate, coming from upstairs. "Did you hear that?" Leah whispered. Everyone froze, straining to listen. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was walking around on the second floor. "It's probably just the wind," Jason said, though even he didn't believe it. "I don't think wind makes footsteps," Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Without saying a word, Jason started up the staircase, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The others followed, though every step felt heavier, more uncertain. The upstairs hallway was narrow, lined with old portraits of people whose eyes seemed to follow them as they moved. The footsteps had stopped, but the air was thick with tension. They reached the end of the hallway, where a single door stood slightly ajar. Jason pushed it open. Inside was a bedroom, perfectly preserved, as if it had been waiting for someone to return. The bed was made, the furniture dust-free, and on the dresser a mirror reflected their wide-eyed faces. And then they saw her. Standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, was the figure of a woman. She was dressed in a tattered black dress, her hair long and matted, covering her face. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and though her head was bowed, they could feel her eyes on them. Cold, piercing, filled with malice. Leah gasped, stepping back, but the figure didn't move. Is that real?" Mark stammered, but no one answered. They were all too frozen in terror. And then the figure slowly lifted her head. Her face was gaunt, skin stretched tight over her bones, her eyes black as coal. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and she took a step forward. Without a word, they bolted from the room, running down the stairs as fast as their legs would carry them. The house seemed to shift around them, the walls narrowing, the shadows growing darker. They could hear her now, her footsteps pounding behind them, faster and faster. They reached the front door and burst outside, slamming it behind them. The storm hit them like a wall, the wind and rain drenching them instantly, but none of them cared. They ran, not stopping until they reached the end of the lane. Breathless, soaked, and terrified, they turned back to look at the house. The front door was closed, and the house stood silent in the storm. But just before they turned to leave, they saw it. Standing in the upstairs window, staring down at them, was the woman in black. Her eyes gleamed in the darkness, and her smile was wide and cold. They never spoke of that night again, but none of them ever returned to the widow's house. The power came back the next day, and the storm passed, but something about the town felt different after that. Darker. And every now and then, when the wind howled just right, they could still hear her, Margaret Holloway, the widow of Millhaven, calling them back to her house. Late one autumn night in the remote town of Willow Creek, there was a story that every local knew, but no one dared speak aloud. It was the tale of the Watcher. The legend warned of an unseen presence that haunted the desolate road leading to an abandoned farmhouse just outside of town. Everyone in Willow Creek claimed to have heard the story growing up, of people who would walk or drive along that road and suddenly feel as though they were being watched by something or someone lurking in the shadows. But like most stories passed down through generations, it was easy to dismiss until it happened to Paul, Heather, Tom, and Lisa. They were college friends who had grown up in Willow Creek, and with Halloween approaching, they were looking for something to do. The parties in town had gotten predictable, and they craved a thrill, something that would make the night unforgettable. It was Paul who suggested they explore the old farmhouse on Watchers Road. Everyone knew it had been abandoned for decades, ever since the family that lived there mysteriously disappeared. But what made it even more chilling was the road itself, the site of countless accidents, disappearances, and strange occurrences. The locals avoided it, especially at night. Heather was the most hesitant. "I don't know, guys. The stories about that road, there's something not right." Lisa shrugged, playing it off as local superstition. "Come on, it's just an old house. How bad can it be?" Tom chimed in. "It's Halloween. What better way to spend it than to finally figure out what all the fuss is about? Besides, it'll be fun." Reluctantly, Heather agreed, and they all piled into Paul's car, driving out of town toward the infamous Watchers Road. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, ghostly light over the landscape. The road itself was barely lit, winding through dense trees that seemed to grow closer and closer together as they drove. The air felt heavy, and an unnatural stillness settled over them as they ventured deeper into the countryside. As the car approached the turnoff to the farmhouse, Paul slowed down, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "Well, here we are," he said, trying to sound casual, though there was an edge to his voice. The farmhouse was barely visible in the distance, a looming shadow against the night sky. It sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by dense woods. The place looked like it had been forgotten by time, its windows broken, the porch sagging, the entire structure draped in an eerie silence. They parked the car at the edge of the driveway and got out, flashlights in hand. The moment they stepped onto the gravel, something changed. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees, and with it came a feeling, a prickle at the back of their necks, as if they were being watched. "Do you feel that?" Heather whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. Lisa laughed nervously, trying to shake off the feeling. "It's just the wind. Come on, let's check it out." But even Lisa couldn't hide her unease as they made their way down the path toward the house. Every step felt heavier, like they were walking through molasses, the air thickening with each passing moment. When they reached the front porch, Paul hesitated before stepping onto the creaking wood. The house loomed over them, its dark windows like empty eyes watching their every move. "Let's go inside," Tom said, his voice shaky. Heather bit her lip, glancing back at the road. She had the overwhelming urge to run, to get back in the car and leave. But something kept her rooted in place. It wasn't just the house, it was the feeling, the sense that something was there, just out of sight, watching them from the trees. They pushed open the front door, which groaned on its rusted hinges, and stepped into the darkness. The inside of the house was worse than they had imagined. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay, and the floorboards creaked ominously beneath their feet. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the beams of their flashlights. Old furniture, draped in tattered sheets, sat abandoned, as if the family that had once lived here had left in a hurry and never returned. As they moved through the house, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every creak of the old house sounded like footsteps behind them. But when they turned, there was nothing there. "Let's check upstairs," Paul suggested, though his voice was barely above a whisper. They made their way up the narrow staircase, which seemed to stretch on forever in the dark. When they reached the top, they found themselves in a long hallway lined with doors. One of them was slightly ajar, and a soft light flickered from within, though none of them had brought candles or anything else that could explain it. "Did you see that?" Tom asked, his voice trembling. "Who's there?" Paul called out, though there was no answer. They approached the door cautiously, their flashlights barely cutting through the heavy darkness. When Paul pushed it open, they froze. Inside the room was a single chair facing the window, and sitting in the chair was a figure, slouched, unmoving, its back to them. The figure was draped in a long, tattered coat, and its head hung low as if it had been sitting there for years, waiting. "What the hell is that?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, the figure stirred. Slowly it began to turn, its movements jerky, unnatural, as though it hadn't moved in decades. When it finally faced them, they saw its face, pale, gaunt, its eyes hollow black pits, and it was smiling, a cold, lifeless smile that sent a chill down their spines. Without a word, the figure stood, towering over them, its body shifting in impossible ways, stretching toward them as if the shadows themselves were alive and reaching out. Heather screamed, breaking the paralysis that had gripped them all. They bolted down the stairs, stumbling over each other in their panic, the sound of the figure's slow, dragging footsteps echoing behind them. The front door slammed shut just as they reached it, trapping them inside. "Help!" Paul yelled, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. And then the sound of footsteps stopped. Silence filled the house, the oppressive kind that makes you hold your breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. Suddenly, the windows shattered, and a gust of freezing wind whipped through the house. From the corners of the room, shadows began to move, slithering across the walls like ink spilling from an unseen source. The Watcher was here. One by one, they felt it. The cold, invisible hands wrapping around their throats, the whispers of something ancient, something malevolent filling their ears. The feeling of being watched, of something always lurking just behind them, was no longer just a sensation. It was real. It was alive. And it wasn't going to let them leave. The next morning, Paul's car was found at the edge of Watcher's Road, the doors wide open, the headlights still on. But there was no sign of Paul, Heather, Tom, or Lisa. They had vanished without a trace. The locals shook their heads when they heard the news. Just another group of kids, lost to the curse of Watcher's Road. Some say if you drive down that road on a dark night, you can still see them, standing in the shadows, their eyes following you as you pass by. And if you're unlucky enough to stop, you might hear the whisper, faint and cold, beckoning you toward the house where the Watcher waits, always watching, always waiting for more.